So hopefully you came up with something like this. Notice that I've also created a constant definition at the start of the program for the LED pin so that I can change which output I'm going to be flashing on and off at a later date if I need to. You should have then created a procedure called flash 5 times, whose return type is void because it is a procedure, not a function, and which takes no parameters in its brackets here. Then between the squiggly brackets, you should have simply inserted a for loop where the counter moves from 1 to 5 and it flashes the LED on and off each time. Now this is all well and good and perfectly useful, but it would be much more useful if I could write a procedure that could flash the LED a different number of times depending on the context. So instead of always flashing 5 times, if I could vary how many times it flashed. And to do this, we're going to need to make use of parameters. So if I change the name of the function, so instead of flash 5 times, it's now called flash n times. And the mathematicians amongst you will know that we often use n for an unknown value. And if inside my brackets here, where we define what parameters the procedure requires, if we add in an integer called n, and then in our for loop, we make use of that integer here, and in our call to the procedure, we give it the argument, say, 6, what will happen is this. When I call upon the procedure flash n times, I will give it the number 6. And the procedure knows that it is expecting an integer, and it will store that number 6 into the variable n. And in the for loop, it will then flash from 1 to n number of times. In this case, from 1 to 6 inclusive. So it will flash 6 times. If I change the number that I pass to the procedure up here to say 12, it will now store 12 in the variable n, and it will count from 1 to 12. Now this is clearly a much more useful program, as it means that I could make use of the flash n times procedure in many different places in a long and complicated program, flashing it a different number of times depending on the specific context where I called upon it. Now we've actually already seen procedures that take parameters. In fact, the digital write procedure right here takes 2 parameters. It takes the number of the pin that we want to control, which is an integer, and whether or not we're going to make it high or low. And exactly the same as when we've defined our own procedure with our own parameters. This is how it's doing it behind the scenes. So what I'd like you to do now is upload this code, have a play around with changing the number in this set of brackets when we make our call to the procedure, check that everything's working, and when you think you've understood what's going on, come back and we'll move on to the next exercise. What I'd like you to do now is try and write a slightly different procedure where instead of flashing n times, you are going to turn on n LEDs. Now, obviously, you can only give it a number between 1 and 8. So let's start it off with the number 5, for example. And you're going to change the name of your procedure down here, instead of flash n times, also to be turn on n LEDs. And I would like you to try and fill the space between these 2 squiggly brackets with code that will take this integer n and will turn on that number of LEDs. Don't forget that you're also going to need to have a for loop in your setup section to turn all of the pins from 1 to 8 into outputs before you can use them in the rest of your program. You might also want to get rid of the const int LED pin declaration at the start of this program, as it's no longer going to be relevant. Once you think you've got it working, upload it to double check and then show your teacher.